Hello everyone, this is Hebzibah, your host for the session today. And on behalf of the Inclusive Cities Center at the National Institute of Urban Affairs, I welcome everyone to the introductory lectures under the Inclusive Development Lecture Series. Cities today are centers of technological advancement and economic growth, and concurrently the breeding ground for poverty, inequity, environmental hazards, and communicable diseases. In addition, often economic development can directly affect natural resources, including land. The existence of inequitable cities is one of the most significant concerns of rapid urbanization. The expanding underprivileged parts of society are a key motivation for Indian cities to invest in inclusive and comprehensible development methods. These lectures aim to deep dive into some of these diverse yet pertinent issues to find synergies through actively engaging with urban academicians in order to delve with some of these questions and try and explore ways for developing equitable and resilient cities. For our session today, we are joined by Professor Dr. Amita Bhide. Welcome, Professor Bhide. For the benefit of the audience, let me take a minute to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Amita Bhide is the Dean and Professor in the School of Habitat Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and is part of the Center for Urban Policy and Governance. She has been deeply involved in issues related to urban poor communities, community organization, and housing rights movements and advocacy groups. Professor Bhide's recent work at the School of Habitat Studies has been on issues of urban development, in particular those concerning urban transformations and their links to inclusive and sustainable development. She has extensively researched urban local governance and planning, water and sanitation, housing, and land issues. She attempts to develop a theoretical and action model of urbanization that is relevant for Global South through an engagement with several transformative groups at the city, provisional, and national scale. Today, Professor Bhide will be speaking on what is inclusivity, its representation in the Sustainable Development Framework (SDGs), and addressing inclusion in the urban and social development. The broader outline of the lecture will be expanding on equity and inclusive development and the lack thereof, which gets manifested in Indian cities. The lecture aims to orient our audience today on equitable end results through policies, planning, and governance interventions. In the current rapid urbanizing economy, one of the pivotal challenges is inequitable access to essential services, livelihood opportunities, and disparity in representation in the participatory planning mechanisms. The Sustainable Development Goals aim to build inclusive, resilient, and thriving environments for all, providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. Thus, it is crucial to understand the concept of inclusive cities and how effective management and planning is necessary, especially with the number of increasing vulnerabilities in India. This lecture shall touch upon the principles of inclusion, namely equity, access, opportunity, and rights in the Sustainable Development Framework. A combination of research with first-hand empirical material collected in cities and urban areas has been visited upon by ma'am. Overall, the lecture offers concepts and avenues for an inclusive, equitable, sustainable urban future. On that note, I would like to invite Professor Bhide to share her insights on the subject of urban inclusion and breaking down inclusivity as a concept. Over to you, ma'am.
In the context of urban development per se. To just very, very briefly, if you see why we are talking about urban inclusion, the overall scope of this lecture. In this, we will ask and frame our entire lecture around several key questions. So the first question is really, why should cities be inclusive at all? Uh, and this is really a very, very fundamental question. Uh, Often many of us may take it for granted that of course every place has to be inclusive, and cities like rural India should also be inclusive. But on the other hand, inclusion has always been thought of, or in some ways, is something very anti the character of cities. And therefore, this question that we are discussing today uh, of inclusion assumes much greater complexity. It becomes much more challenging to conceptualize inclusion as well. And yet, we are all aware that inclusion has a very important place in the sustainable development goals and also the new urban agenda. So this is something that we will really discuss, and then we will really try to engage with this overall concept of exclusion, the way it has been conceptualized by multiple researchers. This concept, which originated in Europe and which is now being globalized in multiple ways. And how does it fit within the Indian context? What does exclusion mean in the context of India? What are the factors that cause exclusion? And is it possible to think of inclusion? Does inclusion mean the reversal of exclusion? Then are exclusion and inclusion, can they be considered opposites of each other? We need to think about this. And most importantly, towards the end, we will also talk about when the concept of urban is discussed, or when urban becomes a site of exclusion, what are the new dynamics that actually get added to the overall challenge of inclusion. So clearly, as I said, inclusion became and exclusion by default became very, very important concepts with the introduction of the Sustainable Development Goals. But even slightly before that, if one is tracing the history, it was the Social Development Summit in Beijing that really made this concept of exclusion a very popular concept. And clearly, because Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the New Urban Agenda 3, the third version of the Urban Agenda, which was adopted in uh, 2009, clearly they build on previous global agreements like the Millennium Development Goals and the New Urban Agenda 1 and 2. And therefore, then this addition of inclusion becomes much more important. So if one has to read what is the meaning of inclusion, one will need to read the meaning of what did MDGs say. The MDGs basically talk about achieving certain very precise targets at the end of the millennium. And these included things like ensuring that at least 100 million slum dwellers all over the globe get adequate access to water and sanitation. They also talked about how there has to be safe and resilient and inclusive housing. How does one make cities slum-free? So this was the nature of the Millennium Development Goals. Very quantitative, very precisely defined. And the idea was that nation parties and different other stakeholders, like whether it is civil society actors, NGOs, or corporates, come together and societally we try to achieve and conquer the ills which are happening in our society. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals became even more ambitious than the Millennium Development Goals. They are also being formulated in the context of climate change and a keen awareness that if we do not contend with issues such as sustainability right now and right away, perhaps it will be too late for the overall future of humanity. There is another context to the concept of inclusion in the SDGs and the NIUA as well. And that is basically the time at which the SDGs and the NIUA were introduced. They represents a time of transition. Till then or previously, when we think about the previous habitat conferences which were held in the world, like the last one was 1996 Istanbul. Till that time, most agreements focused on two contexts. Number one, that in some ways the world was predominantly rural and urban was growing, but it was not the dominant kind of reality. The second is that most provisions towards whatever were regarded as public goods or human rights were being made by state parties. And we were now shifting towards the end of the millennium and in the post-millennium towards an era where most of these public goods were being not solely provided by nation states, but also in partnership with markets and corporates. So this kind of architecture that one is talking about is a completely different context within which inclusion is being discussed. The third aspect that we need to think about is the precise formulation of SDG Goal 11, which pertains to the urban. And the way it reads, it's a very, very simple statement, but at the same time, a very fundamental and in some ways a very radical goal which has been set as well. And it talks of making cities and settlements. So cities is the beginning point, perhaps because cities are much more challenging, but it is not cities as defined administratively, but also includes urban peripheries and the to be urban, hence the term settlements. And what do we desire to do? What is it that we aim to do in these kind of settlements? That all these settlements should be inclusive. That is what we begin with. And safe, resilient, and sustainable. But it can also lead through the sequence of these terms. And in some ways, inclusive is perhaps even more important because rather than safe, resilient, and sustainable. This is not to say that the others are less important, but in terms of a priority, because we are still thinking of an anthropocentric world where human beings are at the center of affairs. And therefore, this well-being of human beings, for which inclusion is necessary and their safety is necessary. And gradually then, for these human beings and the concern for the rest of nature comes through resilience and sustainability. So why are we talking about urban inclusion at all? First, because cities really are at the cusp of several transitions. There is a demographic transition. So as the world, so in the previous centuries, the world has been a very, very young kind of a world. And gradually, what one sees is that as the world is developing in terms of prosperity, it is also aging. Countries like India, countries like several other developing countries are still predominantly young. But there are already several countries in the world which are also largely aging. So there is a demographic shift which is happening. There is also a spatial shift which is happening, and which is that in 1950s itself, the world became, not 1950s, sorry, 1990s, the world became predominantly urban. So we passed a very, very major transformation there. From a predominantly rural world, we are now large numbers of humans are actually staying in cities, and therefore the importance of cities. we are also at the cusp of a livelihood and work transition. Now, this is also very critical. In previous centuries, when there were no global networks, agriculture, farming, uh, and in some ways self-engagement and self-sustenance were the modes of survival of a bulk of humanity. With industrialization and a system of capitalism, we basically see that a world of work in which one works in offices, one works in factories, the different aspects and classifications of work began, and a separation between a home space or a living space and a workspace also started happening. What we, however, see is that, and this is something we really experienced during the COVID pandemic, as the digital economy expands, the boundaries between work life and what is home life rapidly begin to dilute. So, thinking about the future of work, there is already significant work which is happening subsequently. A lot of humanity is going to be dependent on what are called services and intelligence linked professions, whereas a lot of the menial work, which actually presently engages a lot of us, is also giving rise where these kind of tasks will be done by machines. And a final transition, which is really a climate transition. And I think now, after COP26, many people are aware that what we are actually experiencing is a lot of environmental degradation and a crisis where even a temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius climate in climatic terms is not going to be possible for humanity to sustain. Perhaps temperatures, global temperatures may rise even more, and this will result in more frequent disasters, more vulnerabilities, perhaps more concentration in the urban. And therefore, what all of these transitions mean is that when cities stand at the cusp of these transitions, cities are going to be critical to the present of humanity and also to the future of humanity. And we need to understand that cities, when they are going to be critical to this future, they are both part of the problem and they perhaps contain also the solutions to the problems and the crisis that I have talked about. Inclusion, clearly, therefore, is a very important aspect of these transitions. Because if everyone is not included, then many of these transitions can have extremely severe impacts. Severe impacts not only on those who are excluded, but also for those who are included and for our collective future as well. There are going to be very heavy impacts because our futures are interlinked. And which is why in those connected futures, there cannot be any divides where it's like it's only going to be the poor who are going to face the impacts of climate change and the rich can live in a very secure manner. This is not going to be possible at all. We know when cyclones happen, uh, leveling of all kinds of places takes place. So we need to be aware of this. And which is why the Sustainable Development Goals clearly and importantly talk about the importance of inclusion. In fact, the way in which the SDGs articulate urban inclusion is that they adopt the slogan of leaving no one behind. I think very important, leaving not one person behind. Okay? We often underestimate the power of an individual and the importance of an individual human being. And the SDGs rightfully reiterate that in terms of articulating this principle of leaving no one behind. Next slide, please. Now, when we want to talk about inclusion, we clearly first need to understand, hey, why inclusion? And basically, we need to include people because at the current juncture, people are not included. In fact, they feel excluded. But then let us dwell a little bit about exclusion and what does exclusion mean. Now, unlike poverty, unlike deprivation, unlike inequality itself, exclusion is a very, very troubling concept. And for the next several minutes, we are going to understand this vexing and troubling nature of exclusion. Exclusion was a term which was coined by René Lenoir, a French social scientist in the 1970s. And when he talked about social exclusion, what he referred to was really talking about groups such as beggars, of those who were homeless, those who took drugs, etc., which were lying at the margins of social French society. So, in most of the European nations, the one theory that really is very prevalent around the nation state is that of the social contract. That the modern nation state comes into being because of a contract between citizens and the state. That the state is entrusted with certain responsibilities by society at large. Okay? And so there is a bond between society at large and which also includes the state within it. Okay? And clearly, therefore, when one is talking about these kind of groups who are at the margins of society, one is talking of groups who are not quite part of the entire social contract. There is something troubling. They are standing literally at the boundaries of this social contract. They don't respect the norms of society, and neither does society make any attempts to include them in a fuller manner. Okay? So this is where the concept began. We have to realize that this is coined in the context of a society where there is a mainstream of society which is conceptualized and groups which are fringe groups. Their numbers are small, and the kind of experience that they have is like standing at the borders. Like they have 1 foot in, or perhaps half a foot into the society. Society is rejecting them, and the groups are also rejecting society. So this nature and this status of exclusion is extremely critical to understand. As it has evolved, one can see that the experience of exclusion and the concept of exclusion is a very, very dynamic concept because it refers to multiple things. Okay? It talks about full participation as really the goal of society. And what does one mean by full participation? That the overall understanding and belief that it is that societies owe everything to the individual, and the individual in turn also owes it to society to contribute and to fully participate. So there is that kind of a bond which is expressed between individuals and society. But when we think about this kind of a full participation, one is then referring to there can be conditions because of which people are not able to fully participate. Such conditions can be conditions of destitution. So where there are people who for multiple reasons are thrown out of families and have to live on the streets. They are mentally then also disturbed, or they may be suffering also from illnesses, etc. So there are, or poverty can be a condition because of which also people are not able to fully participate. So these kind of conditions exclusion can refer to. And it can also refer to processes by which this full participation is prevented. Now, what do I mean by processes? Processes largely refer to uh, things like there may be uh, uh, events like war, etc., because of which people become excluded. There may be large scale evictions in the city because of which people get excluded. There may be large conditions which generate unemployment because of which people get excluded, etc. Okay? Uh, but the vexing nature really of exclusion is linked to the fact that uh, can is someone really fully out of society? No one is. Okay? So there are always shades and shades of exclusion. So it's not fully black, it's not fully white. And so, for example, here, one can think about a homeless person. Okay? Now, this homeless person is clearly excluded. What are the dimensions of the exclusion of this person? A, this person is fully out of the purview of property relationships, the entire citizenship related entitlements, which are linked and to owning property or renting property in a formal manner in a city, uh, and not quite therefore having the entire opportunities that a city can give to this person. Uh, but can we say, therefore, that this person is fully out of society? No, because that person is visible in and out, is also dependent on some of the larger structures of society that try to give some welfare to this person. And you will also see that there are therefore these shades of on what terms you get included and on what terms you get excluded. So the process of inclusion is really or exclusion is really something which is highly relational. It keeps on shifting, it keeps on changing. Okay? There are people who therefore define exclusion as a structural process of social isolation. Okay? That one does get isolated, but the way in which this isolation happens is embedded within the structures of society. Okay? It is also a term, it is also a concept which is problematic to define and to understand because it is a very polysemic context. Polysemic means you can have different meanings. Exclusion means different things to different people. So for a homeless person, the way we talked about it, not having a home and not quite having the citizenship entitlements is the meaning of exclusion. For a Dalit person, having some opportunities, but at terms which are extremely indignified terms, may be the experience of exclusion. For a woman who is deserted by her husband, being in society, but at the same time not having the protection of an entire family and therefore consistently being pointed at is perhaps the experience of exclusion. And exclusion is of therefore very, very contextual and depends really. So if the context is different, the nature of exclusion is going to be different. So there are three things that I talk about here. There are some factors and some concepts through which different dimensions of exclusion are linked, and amongst which there are three very, very major structures and concepts which are linked to the overall concept of exclusion. The first is that of poverty. Okay? I already said that poverty is not the equivalent of exclusion. But at the same time, if you look at chronic poverty, people who are poor for multiple numbers of years and for whom poverty is not incidental or linked to a particular event, uh, but that they are poor perhaps even intergenerationally. Here one sees that deprivations, disadvantages, denials are really aspects of poverty which are very, very exclusionary. Similarly, one thinks about exclusion in relation to the overall concept of social democracy. And in a social democracy, as I said, social democracy comes from the social contract theory that society owes everything to realize the full potential of individuals and vice versa. And in this kind of a concept, people who don't have rights, people who don't have opportunities, and institutions which do not give these opportunities to certain groups of people become a exclusionary dimension that one needs to think about. And there is another key concept or structure that we need to think of, and which is that of boundaries. And boundaries is a research area which has really emerged very, very strongly in the last 10, 15 years or so. And the concerns that boundary research talks about is making all of us realize that whatever we talk about, most institutions are not universal in their scope, but rather what they are is having different kinds of uh, inclusions and exclusions. For example, if we talk about the caste system, there are certain people who get included and there are certain people who are kept out. Or we think about the migrants. Urban migrants are included in some ways in society and in society, but there are other ways in which they are kept out. Now, what defines this? What are the limits? What are the nature of this closure of society or any particular institution? Whether people who are excluded can have the agency to actually contest some of these closures and get included. These are all important questions that one has. And similarly, it also brings in issues of identity. One important strategy, which has therefore been talked about for inclusion, is to be actually present in these institutions, irrespective of whatever. For example, when we talk about that there should be 33% reservation for women in all city governments. One of the reasons for this is the presence of women in city governments will ensure that there is some kind of representation and some kind of voice which will be expressed by these women. So these are the different dimensions of which will make us think of both what is exclusion and in reverse, therefore, when we think about inclusion, what are the different layers and aspects of it that one should be considering. I'll very quickly talk about this overlap or also differences between the concepts of exclusion and poverty. So I think definitely exclusion does include poverty, but at the same time, the experience of exclusion also transcends poverty. Because poverty usually thinks about only thinks about in class dimensions. So who is elite class, who is a middle class, and who are the have-nots or the poor. So it's a very vertical kind of set and largely linked to class. On the other hand, when we think about exclusion, the concept of exclusion is also something which is very, very horizontal. Okay. Now, what does one mean by horizontal? Horizontal closures think about group relationships and the way in which people can be kept out of these groups. And therefore, it is an experience of horizontal exclusion. And the importance, as we talked about, of the sense of agency, the aspect of voice, and group identity. So there may be people, just to give and reinforce this thing, in a single classroom, you may have Dalit children and also non-Dalit children. Right? On the other hand, the Dalit children may feel extremely insulted. Their dignities may be hurt because of the kind of experience of teaching, of privileging some people and some children and non-privileging of others. So, which is why this kind of distinction that one should make between poverty and exclusion. So when we think about exclusion, however, when we think about poverty being a part of that exclusion, one should think about three important terms. One is multidimensionality, which means that even poverty or exclusion having multiple dimensions, social, economic, political, it also being intersectional, that there are some groups where all of these aspects may be concentrated. So a woman may also be deserted. She may also face exclusion because she is a woman, and there may be additional layers because she is also a Dalit or perhaps also poor. Okay, so when these intersections become more intense, the experience of both deprivation, as in poverty, as well as exclusion starts becoming more and more intense. And we need to also think of how some of these patterns start getting congealed or consolidified and solidified over a period of time and perhaps over a number of years and also generations. There are two important researchers whose inputs I would like to bring here. The first is Naila Kabir, and where Naila Kabir begins to think of when we apply the concept of exclusion in developing country context, there are important challenges. And because so far developing countries have largely been using the concept of poverty, and which itself is very, very widespread. So when we think about in urban areas, 40% people, 23% people, 30% people, in some cases 90% people staying in informal settlements or being poor, we are really talking of whether the mainstream society really engages in a social contract, and we are talking of fringe groups, or whether exclusion and groups that stand at the boundary of some of these society, that boundary itself, those who are outside the boundary, make up a sizable group, making us question the nature of the boundary itself. Okay? So Naila Kabir then says the value of exclusion in these kind of contexts is two. Number one, that they point out to us what are particular groups, who are they, what are those identities who face peculiar problems. Okay, remember, we define in India poverty by income. We have always tried to give it a nameless, faceless kind of character. But what Naila Kabir is pointing out, how is it that particular groups tend to be more poor? How do particular groups feel more discriminated? So there are problematic groups, identities here. And there are also problematic processes here. Okay? So how is it, for example, that when we think about India, there has been a long tradition of producing housing for the weaker sections. But how is it that none of these weaker section housing has actually benefited those who are really poor or those who are excluded? So these kind of questions, Naila Kabir says that it is the concept of exclusion which helps us to ask these and to engage with this. The second interesting contribution is by Amartya Sen, who talks about and points attention to institutional processes of two kinds. And he says that exclusion can be passive exclusion. What does passive exclusion mean? Passive exclusion means basically that institutions pretend a neutrality. And this kind of a neutrality mm, there are things which get, things and people who get excluded. Okay, so you can take the example of what I talked about just now. There is EWS housing provision, but there are many groups who are left out of this purview, and the really poor groups are left out. Now, this can be attributed to the kinds of conditions to be eligible for that EWS housing, right? And therefore, this can be said to be a passive exclusion, that there is no recognition of what it means to be excluded, and you have not made the process sensitive enough to be pro-poor or pro-excluded. Similarly, there can be downright very, very active terms of exclusion. And what does this active exclusion means? When public institutions or social institutions have a downright bias against particular groups, and the way in which individuals who represent these institutions take steps to keep certain groups away, that can be said to be active exclusion. Overall, taking a stock of what is exclusion, we are really talking of exclusion can have multiple layers, because it is located in relations within individuals. It can be intra-household, it can also be inter-households. There can be entire community groups, and communities can keep certain groups and certain individuals away. For example, we all know for a very long time, couples who did intercaste marriages, interreligious marriages, were driven away, or there was a complete closure on them through certain community institutions, right? So communities can play a very strong role in exclusion. There can be institutions which can be involved in exclusion, and both public institutions as well as larger society institutions. And of course, there is society at large, which also has several layers of exclusions. Next, please. So who gets excluded? So I think this is like a reiteration, but just to make it simplified, the basis of exclusion can really, really vary, and they are highly contextual. So a group which is excluded in one society may not necessarily be excluded in another society. This needs to be remembered. So the significance of exclusion is important. Also, I think what is important to remember is that there is also a temporality to exclusion. And what begins as society throwing away certain groups, okay, can also be that and can be quickly transformed into groups themselves closing off society, right? So then the sense of closure becomes like a mutual closure. So this needs to be understood. So basis of exclusion can be caste, religion, gender, being transgender, or belonging to particular ethnicities, right? So if there are many people from the Northeast, and the way and the kind of experiences that they have, particularly in southern parts of India or western parts of India, where they are associated with being foreigners, not quite being included within Indian society. So these kind of ethnic experiences can be realized. Disability and mental or physical challenges are also a very strong basis of exclusion. And similarly, people who question norms or who are trying to transcend societal norms sometimes also can be excluded. One very interesting case is really of migrants. What do migrants break? Migrants don't break social norms, but migrants break boundaries and very set ideas that people belong to either rural or urban. Okay, so very tight categorization systems that we have, admin systems that we have, labor mobility really breaks through all of this. And therefore, the migrant also becomes highly excluded. Next, please. Uh, so now comes the question of what do we do? How do we move from exclusion to inclusion? How do we ensure that we leave no person behind and we include people? Okay. And here, I'm not going to actually give solutions because I'm sure that subsequent presentations in this entire series will give us many more clues as to how to go about including people. But since we are discussing the overall concept of inclusion, I would really assert certain things. And the first important question is inclusion the antonym or the opposite of exclusion? No. And I think this answer may surprise many of you because we know that in school we are taught that rich is the opposite of poor. And that can happen. That can still hold for poverty because, as I said, poverty is a vertical concept. But on the other hand, because exclusion is a horizontal concept as well, it leads to very, very complicated relationships. And you may try to reverse some of the forces which lead to exclusion, but that does not necessarily lead to inclusion. Okay? For example, I will again give the example of Dalits. Dalits who have been kept out of mainstream society for a very, very long time in India. I think Indian policy, Indian constitution tried to include them through affirmative action. Action in the arenas of jobs, in the arenas of education. Okay. Does that result in an inclusion of Dalits? Or does that result in partial inclusion and a stronger exclusion in other domains? Now, that is something that we need to really, really think about. Because since we are talking about urban areas, there have been some very interesting studies which have been done, which tell us that if we look at the internet, if we look at and study patterns of marriage ads, it is very clear that there is a very strong exclusion that happens linked to the Dalits even now in contemporary India. And therefore, I argue that inclusion is not the opposite of exclusion at all. Also, another complicated thing that if we include some people, that can sometimes result in the exclusion of other people. Okay? In Bangladesh, for example, there was a policy which was brought in to ban child labor. This banning of child labor, which was intended to protect children, instead resulted in the increasing of trafficking of children for sexual abuse. So this is something which is very vexing and very interesting. Also, that sometimes inclusion of some people can result in an exclusion of other people. Again, an aspect of this zero-sum game of power. But a very interesting thing and a positive thing is really that sometimes societies may be accommodated without declaring themselves to be inclusionary societies. For example, when I think about the character of our cities, many of our cities, even without stating or having pro-poor policies, have been fairly accommodated. And especially in the when cities were more industrial in nature, when there was a requirement of mass labor, they have tended to be inclusive without stating upfront that they have inclusive policies. On the other hand, when you think about inclusive policies, some of the terms of inclusion can be very perverse or very adverse. Like I talked about, yes, you have an inclusive policy for housing, but you have to pay an upfront contribution, which no person who is excluded is going to be able to afford to pay. You add the urban dynamic to this, and the questions become even more interesting, more challenging. So the first is I think we always, especially in India, the overall assumption was it is traditional communities, traditional rural areas, which are very, very exclusive, right? They have excluded women, not given them any mobility. They have excluded Dalits and several other groups who were out of the caste system, and not given them opportunities. And so, when you shift to cities, many of these bonds would perhaps disappear and create new opportunities. It's a question, right? Whether the shift from tradition to these modern city societies, which exclusionary bonds has that shift been able to dissolve, or has it created new exclusionary processes, right? Uh, we also know, interestingly, again, one positive aspect of this urban dynamic is that the facelessness and distance in relation. So many couples which are intercaste couples, interreligious couples, and who find themselves being protected in cities because the city has a crowd. You can become faceless in that. No one really cares in some ways about your identities. Uh, and this can especially happen in the larger metro cities, and that can be positive in certain ways. Uh, Cities also have a multiplicity of groups and cultures, so which is also very interesting, right? And it can create new synergies. It can also create new cultures where several people mix together. The Ganesh Utsav in Mumbai now is celebrated by so many different communities. So South Indian communities celebrate the Ganesh Utsav. I have seen several North Indian communities celebrate the Ganesh Utsav. So something which started as a very common practice amongst the Maharashtrian communities has become a almost like a pan community kind of a festivity. So there are these kind of positive things which can happen in the urban areas. And most importantly, I think the urban has this very interesting characteristic of producing very unexpected interactions in which people people who were affected by partition and came to cities as refugees with literally nothing in their possession, and yet have been able to make it and become influential, fairly propertied kind of citizens in the span of less than a generation. How does that happen? That happens because of the possibility of making connections within cities, which are really unexpected opportunities. And that's the beauty of a city. This cannot necessarily happen in a place where all your social interactions and networks are fairly stable and linked to your own identities. But on the other hand, the urban dynamic is such where the regime of property, law, planning, entitlements, many things linked to being in property or being out of it. And as a result, people who don't have property are really kept out. The second dimension, which really creates a very highly exclusionary potential, is the extreme importance which is given to economic development. And this kind of economic development precedents, I think there are several films, there are several stories that all of us know, create a non-caring attitude about social relations, about your neighbors, and generally what is happening to people. And this is something which creates exclusion as all. And finally, I think the ideas which inform urban development and policies, ideas such as the city should be beautiful and particular ideas of beautification, in which there should be no slums, there should be no informal labor, a beautiful city in which there should be no vendors, a city in which the poor have no place. So these kind of ideas, when they start informing urban development policies, that can have a very exclusionary impact as well. So when we think about inclusion now, there are three broad groups of ideas from which urban inclusion is inspired. The first is the idea of justice or a just city. And just city, for which city is really, I think, the site in which takes place. Okay? But the just city derives from the fact that all humans, all people should have their due rights and their entitlements everywhere. So just as all people should have them, city dwellers should also have them. And therefore, the city should be able to do justice to everyone. Now, this just city concept is a very interesting concept because injustice may be embedded to many institutions within society. In cities like New York, there are concepts like racial environmentalism and environmental racism, which are inspired by the concept of justice. Why is it that certain places and certain places inhabited by certain groups of people face the brunt of environmental hazards in a city? Why are some places occupied by particular social groups having the best of amenities and continue to get the maximum budgets year after year? And why is it that certain places get very less investment? So these are concepts which come from just city, which comes from a sense of affront that particular groups and particular places are left out or not done justice to. The second kind of concept that is very, very important and very critical is that of right to city. And right to city goes beyond that sense of justice. Because when we ask for justice, justice is asked from public institution and from the state. Okay? But the right to city, in some ways, takes matters in its own hands. And it says that people who are excluded in some ways can also shape the city in the ways in which they want. Okay? So don't wait only for things to happen and for that order to accommodate you, but instead you begin showing the action. So, for example, you participate in planning, you participate in budget making, shape the city, occupy streets, disturb the order that the city is trying to create. If there are vacant houses, too many of them in your cities, then occupy these. Okay? So it links to the concept of the just city, but the right to city also very, very importantly talks about how does one visualize the politics, how does one take action in relation to that politics. And the third set of ideas, which comes from the open city concept, which has been given by Richard Sennett, and which says that one needs to become aware of how planning, of how design, of how architecture, which are such fundamental processes in constituting our cities, also embed inequities. And for this, therefore, one should think of not scripting anything. The more open, a little more ambiguous, the little more open for people to express themselves, that city that you create, the more the inclusive city that you can create. Last slide, please. So there are dilemmas in relation to becoming inclusive. And these are dilemmas which are linked to all of these vexing things that we have been talking about so far. Okay? The first question is, what are the systems which are necessary to cognize exclusion? Do we really recognize exclusion? Who recognizes them? Do our cities have any cadre, any institution which can recognize exclusion? We barely have systems which cognize urban poverty, and that also in extremely set manner and in very difficult and sometimes even exclusionary manner. How does one cognize exclusion? How does one recognize the fact that women feel excluded at large in the city? Is there any gender cell, gender component in our planning, in our systems? So these questions. The second is, can we begin to think of, given that there are certain congealing patterns, we know that within Indian cities, certain groups are more likely to be excluded. Is it possible to create some minimum conditions for enablement? And I think that is important, that is critical, that is interesting. In Delhi, for example, we have the system where for electricity, sorry, for water, there was a system where a minimum charge of water was really up to a particular consumption limit was waived off for everyone. And thereafter, one started charging for water. Can there be these kind of minimum entitlement claims which can be created for everyone in agreements? The third question is really, how much do you script inclusion? So we talked about Richard Sennett, who said that you cannot script everything. Rather, if you start scripting everything, it is likely to be more exclusionary, because exclusion is dynamic, right? So therefore, how much do you script? How much do you leave things open and create the scope for processes themselves to happen? It's a very important thing. In India, we have a tendency to script everything because we fear what can happen at a grassroots level, at a decentralized level. But this kind of a direction from the top and to determine everything can itself be exclusionary, irrespective of the content of policy. Another question is city per se exclusionary itself, that there is a certain kind of exclusion which is built into a city? Because ultimately cities are for trade, they are existing, and they come into being because of people's propensity to advance themselves, not to care for others, right? So a certain kind of exclusion will always be there in city. Should we just accept that? And should then the public order or the governmental system, the state system, take responsibility for constantly identifying these emergent forms of exclusion and then trying to make the city more inclusive? And a final question on the dilemma is also that, are there thresholds? Up to a certain extent, a city can absorb inequity. But if one crosses that, then the city is really thrown into chaos. There can be riots, there can be wars, and it can be open to all kinds of insecurities which arise within the city and also from outside. I hope these questions, these dilemmas, these challenges really become the frame through which one begins to address ways in which cities can become more inclusive.
Hi, ma'am. So we have received two questions. The first question I will just read out to you, which has come from the center, is while addressing inclusion in urban development, certain practices of community engagement in the preparation of policies have been adopted in India. However, not all demographics get included in this. Mainly young people who do not have the knowledge or the forum to voice their concerns. Can you share a few cases from other countries with similar contexts that have policies and practices in place to include the groups of infants, toddlers, children, and young people in urban and social development policies?
Actually, I will share two cases from India itself. And I do think, yes, I think it's right. Actually, their voices are not reflected much in either research or in policy or in practice as well. And therefore, it is so very vital to include them. I'll tell you the fascinating work actually done by a group of academics come practitioners located within the City University of New York, which is called the Child Environments Research Group. And this Child Environments Research Group has conducted case studies for several cities across the world, several of them being in developing countries. And in fact, they have also conducted 2 or 3 case studies in India. One of them has been in Mumbai, something which we collaborated on from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and in which there was a very, very interesting assessment done of 3 environments within the environments that children in informal settlements are actually exposed to. One was the environment of schools and how child-friendly schools are. The second was an assessment of their immediate localities and trying to map the ethos of these localities. And the third was an assessment of their play spaces and spaces which are available for recreation. So extremely useful insights which came from this kind of assessment. The Child Environments Research Group, in fact, has developed several resource kits and tools for doing this. So it's something which is a really fascinating work which these academics do in collaboration with several other, I would say, more intervening organizations as well. The second case example that I can give you is again a work which I was involved with along with a friend of mine who is from Austria. And this is called the culture of play. This culture of play, again, inspired by some work done by, forget her name, in Delhi, where we are trying to map what is it that children actually play. How do they play? What are the spaces that they find? What are the barriers that they face? And overall, are there games which are physical, individual, collective games? What are those things which actually get played? And then how to intervene in those situations where there are barriers which are experienced by children. So these were 2 interesting projects. I'm specifically mentioning them because they are in the Indian context. There are similarly, I think, some emergent works in India, largely currently confined to the metro cities, but these voices will definitely come up. I also know that there are interesting assessments and efforts to make children involved in governance in their immediate environments. But overall, I agree with you, the children's voice is really a much ignored voice. And from that point of view, it is excluded, right? Even though we are becoming a young country, I don't think we are listening to children's voices.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for responding to that question. We also have one last question. The lecture had started off by mentioning about the diminishing boundaries with respect to work and home, and that would evolve with time. What you also mentioned was this had become very visible during the COVID times. So, how do you see this affecting vulnerable demographics and their access to employability? And how can policies push for inclusive development in such a scenario?
Actually, there are 2 ways in which I would like to respond to this question. Because one is in terms of definitely the future of work, which I talked about during the lecture. But I think there is a second context that the COVID pandemic also talks about and brings in, and which is really what do we think about public space? And during the COVID pandemic, a lot of communities which actually use streets and public spaces for livelihoods were denied access to that. So in some ways, the COVID pandemic and our response to it reinforced the fact that we think about the road or the street as only a place for vehicular transportation, and it doesn't have a place for vendors, it doesn't have a place for pavement dwellers, and these were people who actually got very actively excluded and removed from the space during the pandemic. Uh, I think for this particular aspect, we need to think very carefully about so policies which in some ways secured the middle class citizens and those who do not use the street as a space for livelihood were secure. These were steps which were created for their protection from the virus and its infection. But the people who use the street were actually denied both protection from the virus and they were also denied livelihoods. So policies can have these kind of unconscious impacts when they do not recognize the differential impacts that they can have on different kinds of groups. Now let me come to the future of work question. And within the future of work, yes, it is undoubtedly true that the kind of technologies and especially digitalization that one is seeing is increasingly seeing a compressing and equivalence of the workspace with the home space. Uh, I think the implications of this also started showing up during the COVID pandemic. And some studies which are emerging now talk to us about the increasing violence which was faced by women. They also tell us, especially even if not violence, the kind of triple burdens now that women had to carry. Because the double burdens of the woman, where she cares for the home and where she also is a worker fulfilling her responsibilities, are always well known. But when the home becomes the workspace, there is an additional burden added of managing the entire household in such a way that the home space has also to be looking presentable as a workspace for several people within the household. So it is not just her own workspace, but it is also the workspace perhaps for her spouse, for managing the living space for the elders, and managing also the working space or the educational space for children. So it really enhances, compresses all those burdens, compresses them in space and time. And therefore, the women particularly feel very, very pressured. I think another ignored demographic within this pandemic is also that of elderly citizens. When people do not have access to digital technologies, do not have the competencies for that, or perhaps believe that they are too old to learn some of these new skills or find themselves incapable to, they feel completely left out. Their entire upbringing, their socialization has been dependent on physical interactions. And when they are cut off from those physical interactions, the kind of feeling of alienation that is created is an extremely heavy burden.
Thank you, Professor Bhide, for the detailed and comprehensive presentation on mapping indicators at the urban level in order to make cities more inclusive and accessible for all. Through your talk today, you have managed to skillfully address various pertinent aspects for acknowledging and addressing the needs and ways to achieve better methods in order to gain inclusivity at the urban development level. On behalf of ICC at NIUA, I would like to thank you for taking out your time and sharing your thoughts throughout the duration of the session. It's been wonderful to hear from you, and it was a pleasure to listen to your thoughts. We look forward to more collaborations on such important subjects of inclusive development. Before we close the session, I would also like to remind our audience that the lecture is part of the lecture series, which can be easily accessed on the National Urban Learning Platform and NIUA TV, which is available on NIUA's YouTube page. Link to both will be provided in the description box. Thank you so much.